So I'm just going to say a few words introducing Ian, who we're very lucky to have with us today, and then he'll take it away from there. So Ian Angus has been active in movements for peace and social justice for over 5 decades. He is a member of the North American Ecosocialist Coalition, System Change, Not Climate Change, and has been a leader of the fight against the Energy East pipeline. For the past decade, he's been editor of the web journal Climate and Capitalism. His published books include The Global Fight for Climate Justice and Too Many Babies, Population, Immigration, and the Environmental Crisis. He is a co-author of the Belém Ecosocialist Declaration, a manifesto that has been endorsed by activists in more than 40 countries. His latest book, Facing the Anthropocene, has been hailed by Maud Barlow of the Council of Canadians as a timely and challenging book, and by John Foran of the International Institute of Climate Action and Theory as a superb presentation of climate science and an illuminating discussion of its socio-ecological causes and effects. That book, Facing the Anthropocene, Fossil Capitalism and the Crisis of the Earth System, is the subject he'll be discussing today. So with that,
I'm particularly pleased to be here to introduce my new book, Facing the... Okay, here's the contest of the night. How do you pronounce that word? You got a choice. Do you say Anthropocene or Anthropocene? Okay, hands for Anthropocene. Oh boy, couple. The one Greek scholar in the room?
Yeah.
And Anthropocene. Yeah, and then who cares? The fact is, in my experience, if you're from England, you say Anthropocene, and if you're from the United States, you say Anthropocene, and if you're from Canada, you just alternate. And that's what I do, as you'll notice when I speak, that I really, each time it comes out of my mouth, I'm not quite sure, but it's the same word each time. The timing of the book was really fortunate. At the time I started writing it, almost nobody had ever heard the word. But just 4 weeks ago, as you might have seen in the papers, an expert working group concluded that the Anthropocene, see there I did it, should be formally recognized as a new geological epoch. As a result, there was suddenly a lot of coverage in the media, and a lot more people have at least heard the word. I must say, however, that judging by the questions that I've gotten from reporters, the subject is still not well understood. And in fact, judging by the articles that some of them wrote, it's actually not understood at all. I can't promise to make it crystal clear in this talk, but I will try. And you know, if you only read the mainstream press, you might think that Marxists like me, and I hope most of you, would devote their time either to sort of unrealistic and abstract discussions of pie-in-the-sky dreams, or alternatively, to evil plots to destroy civilization and impose a totalitarian dictatorship. The people who write such things, I think, would be surprised to find a Marxist writing and speaking about the latest developments in science. But in fact, a commitment to natural science, to the natural sciences, has been central to the development of Marxism since Marx and Angus. They themselves devoted a great deal of time and effort to the study of evolution, soil science, geology, physics. Marx's math notebooks alone cover several volumes. They did that because their socialism was not an abstraction. It wasn't something they sort of sucked out of their thumbs as here's some good ideas. Their idea of socialism was something thoroughly and deeply rooted in the way the world actually works. So their science was inseparable from their politics and their economics and from the class struggle. They studied how the world works in order to understand where the world might be going. The world including all the human beings on it. When he was writing his masterwork, Capital, Marx wrote to Angus that what he learned from German agricultural chemistry, and this is a quote, was more important than all the economists put together. Facing the Anthropocene starts with the fundamental Marxist view that we need to have a concrete materialist understanding of how our world works and is changing. Without that, our political views are floating in midair with no concrete foundation in the world we're trying to change. In this book, I try to bridge the gap between Earth system science and ecosocialism, to show socialists why they need to understand the Anthropocene, and to show Earth system scientists why they must understand ecological Marxism. Since I suspect, mostly in a room full of people whose orientation is on the political side, I'll be talking a little more about the science in this talk, but I'll deal with both. I can't promise to cover it all. In fact, this is mostly a teaser to get you to buy the book. And I do, by the way, I want to mention that the book is available at the back, and if you don't buy it, I got to carry them home. So please, save me that. Okay, let's get going. Most people, I think, are not aware that we are in the midst of a scientific revolution, one whose impact has been justly compared to Copernicus's discovery that the Earth goes around the sun rather than the reverse, and Darwin's theory of evolution. Scientists have long studied aspects of the Earth. That's what they do. But they've tended to do it in pieces, looking at the methods of geology or biology or ecology, physics, and other disciplines. What we've seen in the past roughly 2 decades is the emergence of a new discipline which calls itself Earth System Science. The study of the Earth not as separate components, but as an integrated global system, a set of systems and flows and cycles, all of which interact, including the human components, including the purely physical components, including all of the living things on Earth. And for the purposes of this discussion, one of the major results of that whole shift in perspective that has taken place amongst an important group of scientists is the emergence of this new word, the Anthropocene. And as I said, most people never heard the word until recently. It seemed to come out of nowhere. Actually, it first appeared in its current incarnation. The word has been invented at least 3 times. Some Russian scientists started using the word in the early 1920s, but never really caught on beyond their circles. And then there was one scientist who started using it in the 1980s. But the key was in the year 2000, when it was first announced and first became an object of direct study. But for some years after that, it remained the exclusive property of specialists in the earth sciences. 5 or 6 years ago, it came out of the closet. In 2011, The Economist had it on the front cover. The Pope had a conference, had a seminar on it. The Dalai Lama had a seminar on it. Suddenly, this was something that people were paying attention to. It's now the subject of 3 separate academic journals, hundreds of academic papers, as well as innumerable newspaper and magazine articles, as well as websites, videos, and blogs. There are exhibitions about architecture in the Anthropocene. There are conferences about humanities in the Anthropocene. A few weeks ago, I actually saw a blog post that was headed, "Reading the Book of Mormon in the Anthropocene." And books. While I was preparing this talk, I pulled down just some random examples of books with Anthropocene in the title. And I could have done 2 or 3 dozen more. My book is going to be in a fierce fight for shelf space in bookstores. But of course, we are serious political people. And so we don't judge a scientific concept by whether it's been mentioned in journals or magazines or whatever. We judge it by whether it has been mentioned in a daily comic strip. Because there is the measure of popular penetration of an idea. And by that measure, the Anthropocene breakthrough occurred in December of 2014 in the comic strip Dilbert, when Bob the dinosaur asked his smartwatch to tell him the time, and the watch replied, "This is the Anthropocene epoch." For completeness, here is the final panel. So we've made it. The concept is there. But it's rare for a scientific term to move so quickly into wide acceptance and general use. But I really want to stress that widespread acceptance of the term has been accompanied by an enormous wave of misinformation and confusion about the concept. If you have read any of the articles and books and academic papers even, chances are that what you read got it wrong in some substantial way. One common misrepresentation of the Anthropocene treats it as just a trendy buzzword for modern times. It's an equivalent of the Jazz Age or the Roaring Twenties or something. Generally speaking, is somebody, you can sort of say blank in the Anthropocene, and that's a title of something. It tends to mean modern times, and we're sort of concerned about the environment. But when you see a seminar on art in the Anthropocene or poetry in the Anthropocene, they may have valuable things to say about art and poetry, but it's very unlikely they will have much to say about recent scientific developments and their radical implications for the future of life on Earth. Another common misconception, not just in popular magazines, but especially in political commentaries, I find, and even in some academic articles, is that the term refers to the period when human activity, when human societies first became changing ecosystems. Well, if that were the case, the Anthropocene would be nothing new, because that's what human beings do. We have done it since we first started using stone tools, since we first controlled fire. 2.5 million years, we have been changing our environment and changing ecosystems. So if that's not enough to justify calling a new epoch. A third very common misconception is that it means that humans are now in charge of the natural world. And you tend to see this in the circles that are known as eco-modernists or ecological modernizers, the people who believe that just more technology and better capitalism and we'll do it, and the Anthropocene proves humans are now in charge, we can now run the world. Well, human activity is changing the world, but there's no way we can say we're in control. In fact, what we actually see, I think I got something from Greg. What we actually see is not management and control of nature, but chaos and unintended consequences. More storms, more floods, more droughts, more deadly heat waves, more extinct species, more poisons in our air and our water. In fact, one of the most important lessons that we can learn from today's planetary crisis is something that Friedrich Engels taught us a long time ago. He said, "Let us not flatter ourselves overmuch on account of our human conquest over nature, for each such conquest takes its revenge on us." The Anthropocene is not a trendy buzzword. I hope we can keep it from being that. It's not the time of human influence, and it's not the time of human control. It is the time when human activity is disrupting the Earth system in fundamental ways, setting it on an unpredictable and dangerous trajectory into an unknown, unpredictable, many ways, future. A good starting point for any definition of the subject, to start from this paragraph, which is from three leading authorities on the subject. They said, "The term Anthropocene suggests that the Earth has now left its natural geological epoch, the present interglacial state called the Holocene." I'll explain that in a moment. Human activities have become so pervasive and profound that they rival the great forces of nature and are pushing the Earth into planetary terra incognita, unknown territory. The Earth is rapidly moving into a less biologically diverse, less forested, much warmer, and probably wetter and stormier state, they said. Now that's a starting point for defining what the Anthropocene means. But it's an understatement. Because if the processes that are now driving global change continue, by the end of this century, substantial parts of the Earth will be too hot to live in, some almost are now. Coastal areas on every continent and most island states will be flooded by rising oceans, and an increasing number of animal and plant species will die out, leading, over the next couple of centuries, into a mass extinction comparable to the death of the dinosaurs. In short, the Anthropocene isn't just a word, it's a global emergency. To understand how it came about, we have to adopt what the American Marxist George Novak called the long view of history. If you restrict your vision to just a few decades, or even a few centuries, you won't appreciate the revolutionary significance of what is happening to our planet now. Geologists divide the Earth's history, which is 4.5 billion years. They divide it into a hierarchy of time intervals. Eras, periods, epochs, and then that's where they began, going way back. We now live in the Holocene epoch of the Quaternary period of the Cenozoic era. The Holocene, the geological epoch we live in, started 11,700 years ago when the ice ages ended. What's now being proposed is that the Holocene has ended and a new epoch has begun. Now, this is a very big deal because the divisions in this time scale aren't arbitrary. They aren't simply, oh, let's put in a new chunk here because it's been going on for a while. In fact, they're all kinds of different lengths and so on. What they represent is periods in which the conditions on Earth, the dominant conditions of life on Earth, have changed radically, which they have done periodically over the past 4.5 billion years. The Cenozoic era, for example, was marked by the rise of mammals after the death of the dinosaurs. So the rock record shows different fossils, different animals that lived in that time. The Pleistocene epoch, the one immediately before the Holocene, was marked by the repeated expansions and contractions of continental ice sheets that are popularly called ice ages. 12,000 years ago, the northern hemisphere, right down to Chicago or Berlin, was covered in several kilometers of ice. That retreated 11,700 years ago and began the Holocene. This slide shows the average global temperature in the last 100,000 years of the Pleistocene, of the ice ages. What it shows, the dotted line is the average temperature for the past 12,000 years. That's what it was like before. As you can see, it was anything but stable. It wasn't just cold, it was cold and hot and cold and hot, warm and cold. We evolved as a species sometime just before that, 160,000 years ago approximately. But for 95% of the time that we have been on the Earth, our ancestors lived exclusively in small groups of nomadic hunter-gatherers. There's evidence that some of them had experimented with cultivating plants, wild plants in particular, in general, but the experiments were short-lived. And it wasn't because our ancestors were stupid people, that they didn't understand how plants grew or the need for seeds or anything. They knew all that stuff. But what they didn't have was a stable climate in which they could predictably, over time, build their communities on that agricultural basis. Then the ice went away. And that tiny little bit up there is the Holocene. And for the past 11,000 years, 12,000 years, the average temperature of the Earth has not varied up and down more than 1 degree Celsius. That doesn't mean, obviously, there were colder times and warmer times, but the average across the whole period and across any given period was not more than 1 or 2. And only that period made possible agriculture. And it is no coincidence that within after 160,000 years of us living as hunter-gatherers, within about 2,000 years after the beginning of the Holocene, agriculture was invented independently in at least 11 different parts of the world. Suddenly the conditions permitted it. This led to settled communities and then to the great civilizations of the past 6,000 years ago. Holocene conditions, it's often said, are the only global environment that we are sure is a safe operating space for the complex, extensive civilization that Homo sapiens has constructed. In the late 1980s, scientists began to be increasingly concerned that human beings had moved beyond, as I said, affecting individual environments, individual ecosystems, and so on, and had begun actually changing the world, actually changing the globe. And some of the things that led them to those conclusions were things like nuclear weapons, the impact of fallout, which was suddenly a global impact there had been nothing like before, and the destruction of the ozone layer, the everyday chemical that suddenly turned out to be destroying the upper atmosphere chemicals that are protecting us from the Earth, from the sun's most harmful rays. That work led to the launch, and this is, I think, is indicative of how bad scientific journalism is, not just in this country, but around the world, that I rarely meet anybody who's ever heard of the International Geosphere Biosphere Program, which began in 1989, was finally completed in 2015 and folded into another program, the largest single international program of scientific cooperation ever undertaken. Tens of thousands of scientists worked on this. And their goal was to try and work out how human beings were changing the world, and was it dangerous? What were the effects? Their work in 2004 led to their first synthesis report. It's a book called Global Change in the Earth System, and it's still the best available account of the science of the Anthropocene. This is really where they laid it out. Paul Crutzen, who came up with the word Anthropocene, is one of the authors. He had come up with the word 4 years earlier. This book is out of print. Fortunately, the IGBP, although it's closed down, has arranged to have their website stay on for another 20 years. And the book is available as a free PDF. And I do recommend it if you want to understand it. The book was deliberately written not in a it's got technical material, but it's not a highly technical book. This report summarized the results of 10 years of research into the Earth system in these words. The planet is now dominated by human activities. Human changes to the Earth system are multiple, complex, interacting, and often exponential in rate and globally significant in magnitude. They affect every Earth system component: land, coastal zone, atmosphere, and oceans. The magnitude, spatial scale, and pace of human-induced change are unprecedented. One of the major things that the IGPP did was do extensive research into the past of our planet, learn things that we never knew before. And the one thing they found out for sure is that what's happening to the Earth now, they cannot find a precedent for it. There wasn't another time when this happened. Not in the last couple of million years that we can tell for sure. Today, humankind has begun to match and even exceed some of the great forces of nature in changing the biosphere and impacting other facets of Earth system functioning. Human-driven changes are pushing the Earth system well outside its normal operating range. There is no evidence that the Earth system has previously experienced these types, scales, and rates of change. The Earth system is now in a no analog situation. You hear that phrase occurs a lot in the literature. It's no analog. We have no comparable time in the past we can look at and say it was like that. Now in a no analog situation, best referred to as a new era in the geological history of the Earth, the Anthropocene. The best known, of course, of these impacts is the human disruption of the climate, which in Earth system science can be viewed as the disruption of the global carbon cycle. Scientists have known for a very long time, certainly well back in the 1800s, that carbon dioxide is the thermostat of the Earth's temperature. But we didn't know until the 1990s how very finely tuned this is and how tightly the greenhouse effect is linked to the global carbon cycle. In the Pleistocene, that period when I showed you the wildly varying global temperatures, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere varied between 180 and 300 parts per million. It's a tiny amount, but it has a huge impact. During the Holocene, it varied between 260 and 280 parts per million. This graph shows atmospheric CO2 over the past 800,000 years. They do this by drilling very deep holes into Antarctica, pulling out ancient ice, and then analyzing the gases that are trapped in the ice. The point here is that despite what that period went through, we never got higher than that, never higher than 300 parts per million in the wildest swings of the Pleistocene. In the Holocene, where it has been very stable, it went from 260 to 280 up and down, but no more than that. We passed 400 this year. And that's 33% higher than the maximum level during the wildest times of the Pleistocene, 42% higher than in the past 11,700 years. Wallace Broecker, who's been called the grandfather of climate change, climate history, likes to say, quote, "The Earth's climate system is an ornery beast which overreacts to even small nudges." What we're actually seeing is that we aren't just nudging that ornery beast, we're poking it with sharp sticks. And nobody should be surprised if the Earth system strikes back. Nor should anybody be surprised if the result is a world unlike anything humanity has ever lived through. Well, we can say, okay, 2 million years or 5 million years, or probably somebody can come up with times when it was hotter or colder or whatever. But for the time human beings have been on the Earth, it's never been like this. This year, the average global temperature passed 1 degree Celsius above the pre-industrial level. So it's now out of the range that it was in the entire Holocene. And it's getting close to 1.5 degrees, which has been called by many scientists the boundary between dangerous and extremely dangerous. The Earth has not been this hot since before the ice ages, and the temperature is continuing to rise. And every time they do a new study, it's risen more than the last study predicted. The result isn't just warmer weather, but it's more extreme and changeable weather, raising the possibility of a return to the chaotic conditions of the Pleistocene, but hot instead of cold. That shift, and many others, I've only talked about one of them, there's a whole lot. Nitrogen, phosphorus, we could go through the various chemicals that we have either overused or underused or destroyed that are changing the balance of the way the Earth system supports life, the Earth's life support systems. Crutzen, in February 2000, basically what happened was the IGBP, the International Geosphere Biosphere Program, they'd been going for a decade, and they had this meeting in Mexico, Cuernavaca, whose purpose was get everybody together in a room and let's sort out what we've learned so far. And they're doing their talks, and each expert's doing their talks. And according to people who were there, I wasn't, Paul Crutzen is a small guy with a heavy Dutch accent, neat man. Nobel Prize winner for atmospheric chemistry. He's vice president of the IGBP, and he does something you don't do at academic conferences. Halfway through somebody's speech, he stands up and says, "Stop calling it the Holocene! It's over! It's the," and he obviously didn't have a word in mind. And then he finally said, "It's the Anthropocene!" And apparently the whole meeting sort of shifted, and it became the main topic in the hallways and in the lunches. And they started thinking, that was a concept, an understanding of a shift that gave all this research, it linked it together, it tied together their studies of the ocean, their studies of the air, their studies of volcanism, their studies of all kinds of things, could be seen as this concept of a shift in Earth, in the fundamental way the Earth is operating as a whole. He proposed to call it the Anthropocene, from the Greek anthropos, meaning roughly human being, and that name has stuck. I won't go into the explanation of what that scene on the end, it means recent for reasons that have to do with the original process of naming them. It's hard to figure out how it fits in, but it's there now. It does not mean age of. You often see in the newspapers or something, Anthropocene means age of humans. No, it doesn't. Anyway, he proposed to call it that. Contrary to what many critics have charged, he didn't use the words to blame all humans for global change. And in fact, in his very first article that he wrote about this subject, he said that the effects were caused by a minority of the world's population, that most of the world's population had borne no responsibility for this impact. Some people criticize this based on a word without understanding context. It's the Anthropocene, just as there's another word, anthropogenic, for climate change. Doesn't mean every human is changing it. It means those are changes that only occur because there are humans. Similarly, this is the Anthropocene because it refers to changes that would not have occurred if human beings didn't exist. Not that we all bear equal responsibility for it. Crutzen originally suggested that the new epoch might have begun at the time of the Industrial Revolution, when large-scale burning of coal launched a long-term rise in atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases. And that was an important insight. But as they pursued this in the first few years leading up to that book I showed you, they set out to actually quantify that Could we find in the Industrial Revolution that shift occurring? So they actually put people to work measuring pulling statistics together on all kinds of changes, both to the Earth system and to the way human societies work. And when they did that, and they published it in that book, they discovered a really interesting trend that they had not expected. These are some of the graphs, but all of them are like this. They all show the same pattern. They start in 1750, they all show a slow rise, and then around 1950, a big jump. It suddenly goes up in almost every category, follows that pattern. So you see carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide in the atmosphere, acidification of the oceans, depletion of fish stocks, species extinctions, forest loss, and so on. All of them show this very slow development followed by a rapid upturn in the middle of the 20th century. That period has come to be called the Great Acceleration in scientific literature. And as the authors of the 2004 report said, the last 50 years have without doubt seen the most rapid transformation in the human relationship with the natural world in the history of our species. Last year, the same scientists who did those graphs went back to bring them up to more current. And they were able to update all of them to 2010. And what they concluded was that by 2010, 9 of the 12 indicators of Earth system status that they had, of the shape the Earth is, 9 of the 12 had clearly, this is a quote, clearly moved beyond the bounds of Holocene variability. That is, by 2010, 9 of the 12 indicators that they considered critical were now no longer within the range of variation that we've had for 12,000 years. Words like last year, okay, sorry, back up. You can do it, Willie. I guess I can't. There we go. Nope, I'm going to stay there. Last year, in the most recent upgrade, I told you that. This is why the Anthropocene Working Group this summer voted 34-1, a level of unanimity you rarely get among scientists or much of anybody else, that the beginning of the Anthropocene was somewhere in the middle of the 20th century. They are now trying to narrow that down in order to have enough solid information to go back and get a formal vote, probably in 2020. Words like unprecedented, terra incognita, and no analog state are used frequently to describe the current state of the Earth. We are now facing, by any reasonable measure, a planetary emergency. The United Nations Development Program warns that by the end of this century, the specter of catastrophic ecological impacts could have moved from the bounds of the possible to the probable. Noted climatologist James Hansen describes our situation in dramatic terms. Planet Earth, creation, the world in which civilization developed, the world with climate patterns that we know and stable shorelines, is in imminent peril. Okay, that's where I got to in terms of thinking I need to write about this. And the book has a lot more about the science and the different aspects of the science and what we know about the state of the Earth and where it could lead in this century. And the reason I decided to deal with it is the thing that was obvious to me is that socialists cannot ignore a crisis of this kind of magnitude in the world we live in. Marx famously wrote that humanity makes its own history, but not under conditions of its own choosing. The Anthropocene offers a powerful illustration of that truth, one that Marx could not conceivably have expected. We now face the challenge of changing the world in the context of impending environmental disaster, in the context of terra incognita, a world that is not like the one we have lived in. That's the reality of our time. And that means that the way we build socialism, and in fact the kind of socialism we will be able to build, is going to be fundamentally shaped by the state of the planet we need to build it on. The longer it takes to get the necessary changes underway, the more difficult that transformation is going to be. We have tended to assume, not even assume it so much that we don't even have words for it, that the underlying context in which society operates will remain roughly the same, the physical environment. But it's not. It is changing. And as the Brazilian ecosocialist and atmospheric scientist Alexander Costa writes, the fight to avoid a catastrophic outcome to this crisis engendered by capitalism is the fight to safeguard the material conditions for survival with dignity of humankind. Socialism is not possible on a scorched earth. Those hockey stick great acceleration graphs, along like that and up like that, now heading nearly straight up, display critical impacts of aggressive capitalism spreading across the world to satisfy its appetite for capital accumulation and burning ever greater quantities of fossil fuels to achieve that. Every day, as capitalism's relentless drives accelerate, the trend lines continue to rise and the crisis becomes more severe. If business as usual continues, the first full century of the Anthropocene will be marked by rapid deterioration of our physical, social, and economic environment. The decay of the biosphere will be most noticed as global warming and extreme weather. But we can also expect rising ocean levels leading to flooding of islands and coastal cities, the collapse of major fisheries, already happening, poisoned rivers, and more. Every global cycle, all of the processes and ways of interworking that our planet and we co-evolved in are now being pushed out of their natural boundaries, out of their natural framework. And if that happens, we have the potential not just for single failures, but for a convergence, a catastrophic convergence of multiple catastrophes occurring at once, of loss of biodiversity, of the acidification of the oceans, all hitting tipping points within a short period of time. Catastrophic failure, multiple Earth system failures is a probability as the longer this goes on. And if that happens, the Anthropocene may be the shortest of all epochs, a transition period from the Holocene to something far worse. The only way to avoid that is with methods that are anathema to capitalism. Profit has to be removed from consideration. Change has to be made as part of a democratically created and legally binding global plan that governs both the conversion to renewable energy and the rapid elimination of industries and activities such as arms production, advertising, and factory farming, activities that we can group under a word which I really wish had caught on. Back about 1865, the British artist John Ruskin invented the word "ilth." He said, most of our industries don't produce wealth, they produce ilth. They make us worse off, not better. Well, we are now in a world where that's affecting us on a global scale. There are no guarantees of this, and that's important. An eco-socialist revolution is by no means inevitable. It will only happen if people consciously decide to make it necessary and take the steps to carry it out. You know, Marxists are also often accused of being determinists. You know, socialism is inevitable. Well, go back and take a look at what Marx and Angus said in the Communist Manifesto. But they posed an alternative. They said that the class struggle will lead either to a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large, or to the common ruin of the contending classes. In the Anthropocene, the common ruin of all, the destruction of civilization as we understand it, is a very real possibility. There's a passage from Marx that I think should be much better known. In Capital, he says, "We have a duty to future generations. Even an entire society, a nation, or all simultaneously existing societies taken together are not the owners of the earth. They are simply its possessors, its beneficiaries, and they have to bequeath it in an improved state to succeeding generations." powerful quotation that is not many people's image of Marxism, but a strong one. I had that passage in mind when I got up my nerve while I was writing the book to write to the American poet Drew Dellinger. He's brilliant. I love his work. He's won all kinds of awards. And I asked him permission to quote one of his poems in my book. And you really don't expect famous people to write back to you. But he not only responded quickly, I described my book to him, he responded enthusiastically, gave me permission. And this is the verse. It's from his poem Hieroglyphic Stairway, and the book is Love Letter to the Milky Way. It's 3:23 in the morning, and I'm awake because my great-great-grandchildren won't let me sleep. My great-great-grandchildren ask me in dreams, what did you do when the planet was plundered? What did you do when the earth was unraveling? Surely you did something when the seasons started failing, as the mammals, reptiles, and birds were all dying. Did you fill the streets with protest when democracy was stolen? What did you do once you knew? That poem struck a powerful chord with me. These are my grandchildren, Abby and Sam. And I can imagine, I can hear them asking those questions if they have to live their lives in a catastrophically damaged world, hurtling down a one-way highway to the worst possible Anthropocene. So I posted Drew Dellinger's poem on the wall next to my computer, so I would always bear in mind while I was writing the book that this was the issue. The Holocene is over. The Anthropocene has begun. We still have to go through some formal voting for the scientists to agree, but it's happened. That can't be reversed. But what we do in the next few decades will determine what the Anthropocene will be like and what kind of planet our grandchildren will live on. Next to Dellinger's poem, I posted Antonio Gramsci's famous aphorism, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Because in my view, it defines an ecosocialist attitude towards the Anthropocene. We do know that disaster is possible, but we refuse to surrender to despair. If we fight, we may well lose. If we don't fight, we will lose. And our grandchildren will pay the price. Good luck or bad luck might play a role, but a conscious and collective struggle to stop capitalism's hellbound train is our only hope of a better world. As Gramsci also said, it is necessary, with bold spirit and in good conscience, to save civilization. We must halt the dissolution which corrodes and corrupts the roots of human society. The bare and barren tree can be made green again. Are we not ready? He said. And I say, and I hope you agree, that our answer to Gramsci's question is and must be yes. Thank you.